Hello everyone, this is the RX Daily Dose. This episode is being recorded on Friday, September 13th, and I'm your host, Ian Parnagoni. Thanks again everyone for tuning in this week. I'm really excited with the responses I've gotten on what you're looking for out of this podcast. So continue to connect with me on social media and follow along as I continue to do these podcasts every week. Let's get started with updates from the FDA today. On Thursday, September 5th, the FDA approved Harvoni and Sovaldi for use in younger patients with chronic hepatitis C virus. Specifically, Harvoni is now indicated for use in patients 3 years of age and older with HCV genotypes 1, 4, 5, or 6 infection without cirrhosis or with compensated cirrhosis, genotype 1 infection with decompensated cirrhosis for use in combination with ribavirin, and genotype 1 or 4 infection in liver transplant recipients without cirrhosis or with compensated cirrhosis for use in combination with ribavirin. In pediatric patients, Sovaldi is now approved for the treatment of chronic HCV genotype 2 or 3 infection in patients 3 years of age and older without cirrhosis or with compensated cirrhosis for use in combination with ribavirin. In adults, Sovaldi is also indicated for use in patients with HCV genotype 1 or 4 infection without cirrhosis or with compensated cirrhosis for use in combination with pegylated interferon and ribavirin. The interesting point with this is the added recent approval of Sovaldi and Harvoni pellets. Both pellets come in half-strength packets, so can be adjusted for dosing based on the patient's weight. While both tablets can be taken with or without food, the oral pellets need to be administered with food, specifically sprinkled on non-acidic foods like pudding, mashed potatoes, or ice cream that is at or below room temperature. The mixture needs to be taken within 30 minutes, and the entire contents need to be swallowed and not chewed. Also this week, the FDA approved nintedanib, or brand name Ofev, for an added indication to slow the rate of decline in pulmonary function in adults with systemic sclerosis-associated interstitial lung disease, or scleroderma affecting the lungs. Ofev is the first treatment for this rare lung disease. It was first approved in 2014 for a related disease, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Although the prevalence of this SSc-ILD is rare, about 100,000 people, most patients will develop widespread fibrosis and vascular abnormalities in the skin, joints, and internal organs. Ofev showed that compared to patients who received placebo, those who took nintedanib experience significantly less decline in lung function. When on Ofev, patients need to be monitored for elevated liver enzymes, and it uses the CYP3A4 pathway, so if patients are on inhibitors, they need to be more closely monitored. Another from the FDA this week, on September 10th, they approved the Gvoke HypoPen, an emergency glucagon rescue treatment for severe hypoglycemia. The device from Xeris Pharmaceuticals contains a room-temperature, liquid-stable form of glucagon that is auto-injected when pressed against the body, similar to how an EpiPen works to treat severe allergic reactions. Gvoke can be used in patients over the age of 2 and be administered by caregivers in emergency situations for hypoglycemia. This is a real step forward in treating episodes of low blood sugar in diabetics. For decades, a glucagon emergency kit had been the only FDA-approved way to administer glucagon. However, it was not stable at room temperature and therefore required mixing a powder and liquid with a syringe, which can be intimidating, prone to user error, and time-consuming in emergency situations. These new liquid-stable glucagon kits represent the second approval of glucagon-based products in the past 2 months. In July, the FDA approved the first non-injectable form of glucagon, brand name Baqsimi. The rescue device from Eli Lilly is a powder form of glucagon administered into the nose and comes in a single-use dispenser. Also this week, from September 3rd, Johnson & Johnson announced today that the FDA has granted breakthrough therapy designation for the company's investigational prophylactic vaccine for the prevention of respiratory syncytial virus, that's RSV disease, in adults age 60 years or older. RSV is a highly prevalent, very contagious respiratory infection and a leading cause of bronchitis and pneumonia, affecting more than 64 million people worldwide. RSV symptoms are difficult to distinguish from those of the flu and other respiratory infections, so many who are infected with RSV may not be properly diagnosed. Young children are also at risk, especially those under the age of 2. However, there is a product approved called Synagis, a monoclonal antibody. This new product, however, from Johnson & Johnson, if approved, would be the first with this indication to cover patients over 60. And one market update from this week, GlaxoSmithKline, GSK, announced it's acquiring Satari Pharmaceuticals. Satari Pharma is a startup pharmaceutical company that has been developing a treatment for celiac disease. Satari originally received $10 million in Series A funding from GSK back in 2013, so this is a real good way to get back their investment for this celiac prospect. Celiac disease affects around 3 million people in the US and occurs when the immune system mistakes fragments of the protein gluten, found in wheat, barley, and rye, as foreign invaders and attacks it, resulting in damage to the small intestine and problems absorbing nutrients from food. There are currently no FDA-approved treatments for celiac disease. This new drug could enter human testing in late 2020. So for discussion today, I have one word for you. September. Can you believe it's almost half over? Many people are already planning their holiday shopping lists, or if you're like some of my family members, already done completely. But if you're a pharmacist and you hear September, the reaction may not be pumpkin spice lattes and cider donuts. There's really one thing that comes to mind for pharmacists, and that's flu shots. Flu season is in full swing, giving injections, trying to meet your company's KPIs, billing issues, forms, checklists, allergy kits, and overall headaches. But it's also one of my favorite parts of practicing. This year, though, I think more than others, a lot of patients and even healthcare providers are reluctant to get the vaccine, just because we haven't seen a severe outbreak since about 2009, and many people still think the vaccine doesn't work. We'll break out our discussion about the flu in a few episodes. What I really want to talk about today is what goes into the vaccine, why it changes every year, why sometimes it's not as effective as previous years, and how things can change sometimes even in the middle of the season. Flu season typically runs from October through March, but all year long, countries are planning. There are 142 national influenza centers in 112 countries that collect data on the flu virus and how it's impacting their specific population. They monitor which strains of the virus are making people sick, how efficiently those strains are spreading, and how well previous vaccines have worked to combat their targeted viruses. All of these centers then pass the results of their investigations to one of 6 World Health Organization collaboration centers. Twice a year, in February and in September, the World Health Organization convenes meetings to make recommendations on the viruses to be included in influenza vaccines for the following influenza seasons in the northern and southern hemispheres. Those recommendations are then passed on to individual countries, and it's up to the FDA in the United States to have the final say in what will go into that year's particular strain for us. Once the FDA has determined the flu vaccine for the year, all vaccines are then made by drug manufacturers. Companies each might have their slight variation in how they manufacture the vaccine, but more than likely the flu vaccine is made using fertilized eggs. The CDC is the one to start the process where they give a sample vaccine created already to manufacturers. The manufacturers then inject those viruses into other fertilized eggs where they are incubated for several days so that the virus can replicate. The fluid containing the virus is then harvested and the virus is killed. Each batch of the virus made, what we call a lot in pharmacy, is tested individually by the FDA. The process as a whole takes about 6 months to produce a vaccine in large quantities, and because of that, many manufacturers take an educated guess in January before the World Health Organization meets in February to get their vaccine out early in the season, and so that way they can meet demand. So that's the basics on how the flu vaccine is produced. So what do things look like this year for us? What's out there right now? To know that, let's go into a little bit about the naming of flu strains overall. It's really, I call, an alphabet soup of nonsense. I mean, you'll see what I mean when we talk about it. So there are 3 main types of flu, A, B, and C. They're named after their core proteins they're made out of. Majority of the flu each year is from influenza A. Influenza B rears its ugly head every 2 to 4 years and is less serious. And influenza C hasn't caused any epidemics. Within those main types of flu, there are different strains of the virus. The different strains of influenza are named after the proteins that are on the surface of the virus, H or N. There are 3 types of H, H1, H2, H3, and 2 types of N, N1 and N2, that cause majority of the annual problems. The naming goes even farther by specifying type of virus, place of origin, strain number, and year of isolation. So when you hear A, Michigan, 45, 2015, now you know. And on top of those different combinations, influenza, like most viruses, sometimes swap genes. That's right, swapping genes. This typically happens when 2 different strains affect the same cell. They essentially remix their genes, and a new strain is developed where there is little immunity overall. The most recent reassortment that I can remember that was in the media was from back in 2009 when H1N1 contained genes from a combination of human, swine, and bird. If any of us can remember that far back, that's when the FDA approved a single vaccine to cover for the H1N1 virus, and it was recommended that we receive that vaccine plus the regular seasonal vaccine. And if you're really interested, I'll put links in the show notes to the CDC's website that will go over all the different strains that are covered in this year's flu vaccines, but again, it's alphabet soup. Next week, we'll cover who needs the flu shot, why it's important to get it for both you and others, and some of the myths that patients talk about with the flu vaccine. And that's all I have for this week. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I'll include all links and resources in the show notes below, so please go back and check those out too. Please connect with me on any of your social media platforms and give me feedback on what you want to hear about. I'd love to know what you thought about the episode. And as always, feel free to like, share, and subscribe on any of your platforms. And thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed the rest of your day. Music by Joseph McDade.